welcome to the Book Fair, Children's Literature for Grown-Ups. I'm Anthony, and it is Halloween, and I am on vacation in Mexico. This week on the podcast, it's going to be a little bit shorter. I have an interview with author and illustrator Christy Mandin for her book Millie Fleur's Poison Garden, and a few headlines that didn't quite fit into previous episodes. I will not, unfortunately, be giving any new book recommendations this week, and next week, due to scheduling conflicts, there will be no new episode. First is an article from PEN America at pen.org. What is Project 2025? Project 2025 is a set of policy proposals from the Heritage Foundation, a think tank that describes its mission as building and supporting conservative public policies. The centerpiece of Project 2025 is its Mandate for Leadership, a 922-page set of policy proposals that represents a wish list of policies that it hopes the next conservative presidential administration, whoever the candidate, will implement. Developed primarily by Heritage Foundation staff and consultants, Project 2025's proposals have also been endorsed by approximately 100 other conservative think tanks. Part 1. The freedom to read, learn, and teach. Free expression in public education is under threat. For 4 years, state legislators have passed educational gag orders and facilitated book bans, inflicting a considerable weakening of students' freedoms to learn and read. This summer, new laws are taking effect in multiple states, continuing the worrisome trend, leading to book bans from Utah to Tennessee, and the dismantling of DEI programs and offices from Kentucky to Texas. These attacks on the freedom to read, learn, and teach have largely occurred at the state level, but in Project 2025, a set of policy proposals created by the Heritage Foundation proposes to mimic these efforts federally, and to do so using as many levers of federal power as possible. Project 2025 makes major policy proposals in the education sphere proposals that, if adopted, would dramatically reshape the landscape of American public education. Project 2025 actually proposes dismantling the Department of Education in its entirety, which would eliminate essential data on America's public schools and related research, like student demographics and attainment or curricula effectiveness. Dismantling the Department of Public Education would also weaken the federal government's capacity to focus on national attention on key educational issues like reading and censorship, and as well as address discrimination and ensure equal access to education. Other groups in the education sphere have already shed light on what this would mean, but in this paper, PEN America focuses on Project 2025's proposal that would affect this country's educational system specifically. The proposals that would most affect the freedoms to read, learn, and teach. This is a pretty lengthy read, so I'll go ahead and put a link to it in the Patreon at patreon.com/thebookfair. You can follow for free. No subscription is necessary to access these materials. However, any donations would be greatly appreciated to help the podcast continue. Next up from bookriot.com, books don't just appear on library shelves. Book Censorship News, October 11th, 2024. Books don't simply end up on library shelves. They grow through upwards of a dozen or more checks before they ever make their way into the public or school library collection. Guardrails are part of the process from start to finish. Among book banners is a common claim that anyone can publish anything and get it in the library. This is patently false and undermines not only the professional skills of library workers, but everyone from the author to their agent, to their editor, to their review journal, editors, and reviewers themselves. Just like no doctor tries every medicine they prescribe for their patients, it is untenable for any library worker to read every book put on shelves. And the distinction here is kind of key, given that prescribing medication is just that, prescriptive. Library shelves are open and accessible, but not required reading. Like a doctor, though, library workers who select material for purchase rely on the work of other professionals to do their job to the best of their abilities. Those are called colleagues, professionals, review journals, and community input. But before we even get to the library, all books published in the traditional route go through several processes before they're even available for purchase. Authors seek representation from an agent who is an expert on the kinds of books that are currently selling in the market. Agents are picky about the titles they represent, so only a fraction of authors looking for representation will get that from an agent. Agencies have some requirements or parameters on the kinds of works that they will represent, meaning that the pool of possible books is even smaller. If an agent decides to represent a book, they then need to seek out editors interested in acquiring said book. Those editors have budgets from their publisher, and while some publishers give their editors significant latitude for what they can acquire personally, others choose what titles to acquire through a committee. Though the numbers are typically much larger than this, let's take it as an example. There are 100 books queried to an agent. That agent chooses to represent 10 of them. That's 10% of the books. When the agent goes to sell those 10 books to an editor, 2 editors bite for 1 book each. That gets us 2 of the 100 possible books going through the publishing side of the process, or 1/50th of the books. Hypothetically, that an agent sold an editor an obscene book. First, that reflects on the agent and editor's inability to understand what the obscenity law is, but more realistically, it simply would not happen. Because the number of books acquired by agents and then editors is already minuscule and extremely curated. Books cannot contain obscenity because it's against the law. Obscenity has a standard court-issued definition by which agents and publishers, as well as their legal teams, must abide. It's the 3-prong, 60-some-word Miller test. Even if one of those 2 books in our hypothetical situation were obscene, the legal department of the publisher would catch this before it ever went to press. The Supreme Court has established a 3-part legal definition for obscenity called the Miller test. 1. The average person applying current community standards must find that the work, taken as a whole, appeals to prurient interests. 2. The work depicts or describes in a patently offensive way sexual conduct as defined by state law. 3. The work, taken as a whole, lacks serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. This is an interesting read. If you'd like to read more from Book Riot, as well as more about the Miller test, those links will be available on the Patreon. And finally, from HoustonPublicMedia.org, Montgomery County to reconsider citizen-led book review policy. Just a few months after first implementing a citizen-led review board, the Montgomery County Commissioner's Court may soon reconsider some aspects of its plan to ensure that only true residents can submit a book for review. In March, the Commissioner's Court approved a new reconsideration of library materials policy. Currently, the policy allows a panel of citizens appointed by members of the Commissioner's Court to review books submitted by other residents. However, despite requiring that a person must be a resident of Montgomery County to submit a book for review, the residency of an applicant is not actually checked. Quote, "It's kind of a messed up policy. There are some things in here that need to be fixed," Precinct 3 Commissioner James Nowak said. Quote, "We do need to make sure that if someone is going to file a complaint, that they're a Montgomery County resident. It's mentioned in here that you need to be a Montgomery County resident, but then on the next page it says we're not going to require them to provide any sort of proof that they're a resident." The court had 2 agenda items regarding Montgomery County Memorial Library System, including one about bylaws and policies. During the public comment period, several residents brought up issues they had with the book review board, including who exactly was allowed to submit a review. County Judge Mark Keogh, who authored the policy, said no proof of residence was required to allow Woodlands residents who technically live in Harris County to participate. The judge said He understood the reasoning, but still thought more should be done. Quote, "We need to make sure they're Montgomery County residents," he said. Quote, "We have worked really hard as a court and as elected officials to bring in great books and make sure that we have a library that's kind of reflective of everybody in our community. What's to stop one person from coming in and pulling that book, or all of those books?" Next up, an interview with Christy Mandin, author and illustrator of Millie Fleur's Poison Garden. If you like the work being done on the podcast, you can leave a review or rating wherever you are listening to the podcast now. You can check out more resources at patreon.com/thebookfair. You can even leave a donation or a recurring donation that would help the podcast keep going. You can also follow the podcast on social media at Facebook, Instagram, or Threads at BookFairPod. And lastly, the easiest and best way to support the podcast is to simply share it with somebody, a friend in your life, a relative, an educator, or a young reader. Now, let's get on to an interview with Christy Mandin. Christy, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
Good. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
No problem. To kick off the interview, Christy, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your book, Millie Fleur's Poison Garden?
Sure. So I am an author and illustrator of picture books, and I wrote this book after stumbling upon an article about a real-life poison garden. So this book is about an eccentric little girl who moves to a very humdrum town where everything is the same, and she plants a wild and weird garden, and the local Rosebud Club is in a tizzy about it and demands that she mow it down. And she says absolutely not, and goes out and finds people who appreciate what she has to grow in her garden.
So Millie is starting to find who her audience is in reaching people that appreciate her garden.
Yeah. At first she considers well, maybe I should plant a few roses because people here seem to like that sort of thing. And it's less a statement of trying to squelch her personality and more of an empathetic, look, I get it. What I like is different. I would like for people to feel comfortable. But then ultimately she decides, you know what? No, I don't have to make myself small and I don't have to conform because nothing that I'm doing is hurting anybody. It's not poison. It's just different.
So as Millie moves in and she starts to build her garden, there's a pressure for her to cater to the local tastes.
Mm-hmm. Yes, they tell her your garden is unacceptable, and according to our rules, it doesn't fit. And she says it's not poisonous. It's just different. So
unacceptable. That's a very charged word for a young character like Millie. How does Millie respond to being told that something that she is passionate about is unacceptable?
She's in the illustrations, okay, because, with picture books, you tell part of the story with the words, part with the illustrations, and part with building suspense and the page turns. And we turn the page after that interaction, and we see her pretty visibly grumpy. She does not understand why other people are concerned with what she grows in her garden. And her mom tells her, your garden is different from anything they've ever seen before. And some people are afraid of things that are different. And she tosses and turns and thinks about it. And she thinks, no, my garden makes things more interesting. They're wild and weird plants and they make my life fun. So she decides, I'm keeping my garden and I'm actually just going to invite people to see how great it is.
And so with telling stories with words and pictures, how are you contrasting the fact that her entire personality is so different from Garden Glen and the rest of the community?
So Millie, sorry, I'll wrap it over here. Millie is, she dresses differently. She looks a little witchy. And then her garden has teeth and fangs and, tentacles, And so everything about Millie is different. Even the house that she moves into at the edge of Garden Glen, like she is literally and figuratively on the fringe of society. All the houses are exactly the same except for the one that she moves into. So visually, right out of the gate, like her house is different, her car is different, her whole vibe is different. So we already know, like, whatever Millie's going to bring to Garden Glen is not going to be what Garden Glen is used to.
And Millie being so different, it really highlights how young people, as they're coming up, are really experimenting with who they are and changing up their style from what they see around them, from a kind of a want to discover their own personality.
Right. Yeah. And it was important for me to show that she had not only a built-in support system for that, like her mom is cool with it. You know, she says, only plant roses if that's what makes you happy. But Millie also goes out and finds her own group. And I wanted to highlight that because not a lot of kids, you know, standing out from the crowd, that's scary. And as much as like I wanted to put that in this book, it can be really difficult when you're a kid or even as a grown-up to be different, to be weird. And I just wanted to show that she did not feel bad about that. She felt fine with who she was, and her mom was fine with who she was. And when she went out and confidently showed her friends who she truly was and wasn't a shrinking violet, she found people who were the same kind of weird as her. So,
and through the support system of her mother and the group of people that she finds, she really discovers that different doesn't necessarily mean bad.
Right. And I think that when I first started writing the book, I thought I really wanted to call it The Poison Garden. But how, first of all, how am I going to sell that as a children's book with, you know, poison in the title? But I felt strongly that that needed to be in there because what we deem as good or bad, poison or not poison, it matters. And so kids, you know, they're watching, like, especially with like the current climate, it being an election year, things like that. They're watching grown-ups say what is acceptable, what is not, what is good, what is bad. And I really wanted to equate weird with wonderful and kind of change the weird is not poison, weird is wonderful. And weird is what, you know, people aren't enamored with sameness. They love weirdos. Astronauts are weird. Scientists are weird. Innovators are weird. All new ideas are weird at first. And so if we just deem something that is unfamiliar or weird as bad, then we don't innovate and we don't grow. So it was really important for me to put that in there.
And you mentioned outside factors such as an election year. I always talk about how children are so much smarter and more aware than a lot of people give them credit for. Do you think that highlighting the differences within Millie Fleur's Poison Garden kind of helps teach children about when you're looking at things around, they're looking at things around them, seeing that weird is wonderful is a message that is something that is a message that is applicable to more than just aesthetics?
Right, exactly. So neurodivergence is wonderful. Having people from different backgrounds, that's wonderful. People that think differently from us is not necessarily always a bad thing. You know, it's interesting because everything has become so polarized lately. And I made sure to put in the book, so Prissy Pants is the garden club president. And, you know, Millie, it wasn't going to be realistic for me to come in and have Millie change all of Garden Glen. That's just not how the world works. So at the end of the book, it says, you know, bits of Millie's garden sprang up all over town. So she did have an influence on her surroundings, being bold and being herself. It did change some things in her community. but there's a line that says, but some things stayed the same. And so she had to still learn to live with Prissy Pants and coexist and get along. And, so I thought, what a great message that, like, there's still going to be the curmudgeon. There's still going to be the person who just absolutely refuses to accept you. And that is okay. You can still be you. Just because they dig in their heels, you can still be who you truly are. We have 3 of our 4 children are autistic, and so the wonderfully weird really has been a mantra in our home since we became parents. And I really stick by that, that what you have to offer is unrepeatable, so you need to stay true to yourself. You are a unique, unrepeatable person. No one else will ever have the exact same days and experiences and things that you have. So you have something unique to offer the world.
And so, bringing it back to the character Prissy Pants, as an antagonist and as an outside force trying to change things for Millie, does she learn to get along with Millie despite their differences?
I don't know that the illustrations really convey that. At the end, where it says some things stayed the same, the illustration is of Millie offering at they host a Garden Glen's first annual youth plant and seed swap. And there's an illustration where Millie is offering what appears to be either the child of Prissy Pants or a nephew or a student. It's not clear, but there's Prissy Pants and a little boy, and Millie is offering him a tentacled plant, and Prissy Pants is shaking her finger like, no, not in my house. So yeah, I don't think she learns to accept Millie.
So, sorry. So the ending is more about there are things that don't change, can also be construed as there are things that you have to accept cannot be changed. Millie learns that she cannot change Prissy Pants and learns to get along with her, even if Prissy Pants doesn't learn that same lesson.
Right. And I don't know that Millie gives all that much thought to Prissy Pants by the end. She has found her people, and she's not as bothered. She's not as grumpy at the end about Prissy Pants being so concerned about what she grows in her garden, because she's found the people that appreciate her. So
I think that's a wonderful message of how important it is to decide who we give our attention to. Like I said, when accepting that there are people and things that we can't change, and knowing that there are times when it's acceptable to just say that this person, we're different. I'm not going to be able to change them, but also I'm not going to worry about changing them. I'm going to focus on the people that actually care, the people that are within the community.
Right. Yeah. Because we don't see her offering Prissy Pants a flower or a plant, because we know she's not going to accept it. So, Millie's more focused on the kids, her peers. So.
And I do want to talk a little bit about how this is based off of a real life poison garden. What can you tell me about that?
Yeah, so I was minding my business one day, I was probably scrolling, just doing some reading, and I came across an Atlas Obscura article about a poison garden in England. And that it made my brain do that, like, electrical light up, like, ooh, this is cool kind of thing that it does when I come across, like, maybe a news story idea. And I dug further, and I found out that this duchess at this castle in northern England had, upon the untimely death of her brother-in-law, they inherited this castle. And her husband became the Duke of Northumberland, and they started to rehab the gardens at this castle because they had fallen into disrepair. They'd become like a Christmas tree farm at one point. Anyways, she had a blank slate to work with, and she decided, I'll plant, your traditional English gardens, but I want something different than just roses, something different than every other garden in England. And so she collected 100 deadly and poisonous plants. And the other garden clubs called it a disgrace. And she chalked that up as the snobbery element of English gardening and did it anyways. And people came from all over the world to see it. And I thought, you know what? Like, how often do we say, like, oh, that's bad or that's acceptable or not? And I thought, ooh, I feel like there's a story brewing there because, she's a duchess and it's a little bit of a different thing. But I thought that's how I felt a lot of times, that there's something that I want to do that I like, and someone's either told me that I can't, or it won't work, or it's not acceptable, or it's just not how things are done. And I always hated that as a kid. Like, I was the why kid. Like, well, why? Like, if you can tell me why, then fine. But if it's not hurting anybody, what's the big deal? And then I didn't really set out to put myself in the story, but then when I got to the end, I realized, oh, I see. So.
I think that there's an important point there that is, it's not hurting anybody. The garden it's a garden, something that's contained, and it's not hurting people is different than saying that this is the way that we grow flowers in this neighborhood, and so you have to do this because those are the rules, because that technically isn't hurting somebody, but it's imposing a will on them. And that's kind of the thing about what Millie goes through, of just being herself, showing people the beauty of the weird, and then at the end, not forcing it on people, not making it so that other people have to be this way, just allowing them to welcome her and her flowers and her garden into their space.
Yeah. So, when I was doing the research for this, I was looking up like poisonous plants. And because one of the things that the publisher had said was like, you need to make sure that there's not like, all these need to be fantastical plants. Like, we can't put real poison plants in here. And so I was making sure like I did my research. And I came across something that I never knew growing up. And I've kept a garden since I was a kid because I live in rural Georgia. It's just kind of what you do. And I found out that daffodils, a very common flower, everybody knows daffodils, are highly poisonous. And I thought, isn't that interesting? Because even something so very normal can be poisonous. So if a daffodil is poisonous, then we accept it. So who is out here saying, like, which things are good and which things are bad? That's a question that kids need to ask. Like, who is doing the labeling? Who is putting that label on it? Because then you have to ask, like, okay, but is it just because they don't like it? Or is it because it actually harms someone? So knowing where that distinction comes from, because, like, especially, like we said, in an election year, you're going to hear a lot of this side is good and that side is bad. And it all depends on who's doing the saying of that, So I think that's important to ask those questions.
That's amazing. And Christy, just to wrap up this wonderful conversation, I like to ask all authors this question, and I'm excited to hear what your take on this question is. Christy, how do you see yourself and the work that you do as an author and as an illustrator?
I think all authors and illustrators are trying to kind of reconnect back with their childhood selves. So, like, while I am writing for children, I think I'm always kind of writing for me too as a kid, like what I would have wanted to have been told. And, you put yourself in the book a lot of times. You don't really realize it. And so I think I just am starting with Millie as a character specifically to try to send a message. You don't ever want to start out with a theme or with a message because it kind of kills the writing. But I'm finding that this character is a bit of a disruptor. And I think that is kind of who I want to be as an author and an illustrator. I would like for my books to be a little subversive, and really kind of give kids agency and remind them that their like feelings are important, that they're a whole person. They're not just like less of a person because they're a kid. They're a whole person with whole feelings and dreams and goals, and that all of that is valid. I hope that comes through in my illustrations and work. Kids, the reader's going to take what they take in the end, and it's often better than what I meant for it to be. So that's great, but I do hope a little bit of that comes.
Thank you very much. And that has been an interview with author and illustrator Christy Mandin. Millie Fleur's Poison Garden is available to purchase wherever books are found. You can find more of her work at christymandin.com, as well as follow her on Instagram at Christy Mandin. This wraps up another shorter episode of The Book Fair. Thank you so very much for listening. There will be no new episode next week for scheduling reasons, and then we'll be back the week after that. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll talk at you next time.